Welcome everybody to here it is. Let's start over. Welcome everybody to the Knowledge Commons. My name is Andrew Padilla. I am your co-host today along with Jessica Talisman. I am the Associate Director of Technology at the Center for Geospatial Solutions, where I focus on all things open water data. And I'm going to hand it off to my co-host, Jessica Talisman, to help kick it off.
Sure. So my name is Jessica Talisman. I have a framework. I'm the founder of Ontology Pipeline. I also have a consultancy helping people learn how to build, basically collaborative consulting, how to build taxonomies, ontologies, semantic infrastructures, and so that arm is called Contextually. I'm so excited to have Michelle here. Michelle, we've known each other for quite some time, and she's co-founder of Generationship. In addition to other things, when we were off camera, off screen, I called her the Swiss Army knife of the data and information and technology world. She's a multifaceted and talented individual. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jessica and Andrew. I'm really excited to be on here.
It's definitely our most famous guest so far.
Absolutely, 100%. Yep. Yep. And you may be wondering why we have her on the Knowledge Commons. We're going to start off and just with introductions. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Michelle? You know, how you got started in this field, where you basically your origin story, how you ended up coming to where we are today.
Yeah, I guess I have a very complicated sidewinding journey of how I got here. So I don't know if I can make this that concise, but I'll do my best. So originally, I'm going to go to the Wayback Machine. Like I originally started my origins in South Korea. I was born and raised there. And it's actually thanks to Knowledge Commons, the beauty of the library, that I'm here today, because, I grew up pretty poor in South Korea. But what I was able to do was, when I was 13, have access to a library with extremely fast internet connection and self-educate myself. And so that's really when I saw at least the initial, even though I didn't really understand it then, like the power of shared knowledge and data and like what agreements around that can actually achieve. And so, I like taught myself English. I was able to study for exams. I skipped high school. And I started my career in AI when I was 16. I joined IBM Research, and I worked on the team that worked on Watson that aired on Jeopardy in 2011. That was like that. So that was like a crazy kind of first part of the journey. I spent 10 years working in research, AI research there. And like, I definitely, if there weren't like shared resources around like all of these, even just high school exams, because I had to teach myself high school as well, I wouldn't be here today. So huge thank you to all the librarians and library science folks out there. And then that was kind of like the first half, right? And so at IBM, I really, I guess I should say like I went to college when I was 13. I should edit that. And then I graduated early when I was 15, and then 16, I started at IBM. I studied computer science and mathematics. So actually, I took the exams when I was 10, yes, or 11. And so after I finished at IBM for 10 years, I had come out like with a lot of industry experience, but like research experience around applying AI at the time. This is like back in the days of natural language and reasoning, expert systems, for those of you who remember all of that. That was sort of like the secret sauce of IBM Watson back in the day. But then I didn't really kind of agree with some of the go-to-market strategy. And so I thought, hey, I'm going to understand how business is done. And I want to have an influence on how AI is adopted by the broader industry and like the population. And so I've always had this like passion for that. That led me to end up doing 2 startups, a couple one where I was a founding member, and then one where I was the founder. That's how I ended up doing, eventually going to venture also, because, and that's a whole long story, but we can get to that. But yeah, that's where Generation Shift started. And then we invest in female founders in AI. But then on top of that, as Jessica, you alluded to, I have some other passions because of my personal history. And like, my mother had breast cancer. So I've always been interested in life sciences as well. And so we started a knowledge commons, so to speak, called Kami Think Tank, which is sort of an institute where a friend of mine and I are working on kind of sharing like more specific non-selling oriented AI knowledge. Like our goal isn't to sell a product, but really just start conversations around like real uses of AI in healthcare and life sciences. So I think that was a little bit like kind of all over the place, but hopefully that gives you a big trajectory.
You left out one thing, which is your violin.
Yeah.
And your music, which can also be seen as a type of commons, to be fair.
I never thought of it that way, but yes. And in my brief stint when I was 16, when I first started at IBM, I was based in New York. And I also had the privilege of playing for the New York Philharmonic at that time.
Which is amazing. So,
so yeah, we could go all, I think if you can find anyone else that has as crazy of a trajectory, I would love to talk to them.
We'll look for them and see if we can find someone. But it is super impressive and your contributions. And most of all, I'm curious, like what you mentioned, that the impetus where when you were at IBM, you sort of saw this bigger picture for how you could contribute, and how that morphed. If we could just go a little bit more into that transition, and relate it back to, I know that there's the healthcare aspect and research, how you made that transition.
Yeah, so I don't know how many folks will remember this far back in the IBM days, and the company has changed like many, many times. It's an extremely old company, right? But when I was there at the time, like it was still an organization that very much promoted people off of patents, right? And like, and the way that AI was being deployed to industries was really around like, well, first of all, it was extremely expensive, right? This is also like when I first started, IBM Cloud hadn't come out, Python didn't exist, guys. Like this is how far back it was, because like, I think what S3 came out in like 2008-ish, if I remember right. And so, like the way that AI was being as a go-to-market strategy was like, hey, you have millions of dollars on mainframe. And so we're going to pitch you this like Watson thing. And healthcare was like one area where Watson made a lot of traction at the time, right? Because a lot of healthcare companies were on mainframe and like invested a lot of money and in like IBM infrastructure, and therefore they could use some of the AI products. But I think one thing I really disliked was because it's so patent focused and like IP focused, that also meant that there was no knowledge sharing back to the community. Right. And so like if you had these investments in mainframe, great, you could use the technology and take advantage of AI. But if you didn't, it was kind of like, okay, well, and there were even researchers and things like that who like either couldn't publish, or maybe if they did something that slightly kind of veered onto the patents or, other things IP wise, they would get sued as well. So it was like a very much anti-commons approach, right? And that's also what led me to like becoming so strong of an advocate for open source, right? And like open collaboration, open science, because I've seen like how, when you have this more restrictive go-to-market approach, like it really harms everyone. And like, there's so much more we could have done with life sciences and healthcare and pretty much every industry with AI if it had been more open.
I saw Andrew smile because
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I've been there about the same time, Michelle. So I was in Watson Health from 2015 to 2018, and then 10. I was in Master Data Management Group. But I do have a question for you. Having also been in there and also been in patent groups, that was a very high priority. So we used to sit around thinking about what patents can we create, whether or not they make a product or not was kind of irrelevant. It's just we were just kind of like cornering like intellectual property. Essentially, it didn't matter. But I do have a because also they did pay lip service quite a bit to open source, but in a way that they had open source groups and what open source you could use in your product. But it was different than those folks that were actually producing the open source that were in small companies and or just the general open source, the guy in Nebraska or whoever was producing it. How do you see that the point of view that large organizations like IBM have with open source, and what was good about it and what was not so good about it? Because they definitely embraced it, but it was a different vibe than what you would see among the community members.
Yeah, and I think that's so funny. I didn't realize we had kind of overlapped. I left in like 2011, 2012, so we barely missed each other. But you got to see the fruition of the tail end of that commercialization that I disagreed with so much. but yeah, no, I do think so. You know, again, like the organization has changed. Executive teams, like I think pretty much everything has changed since I was there, pretty much. But I will say, like, in the modern version of IBM, at least that I've seen so far, is extremely, like, let's say, promoting itself as like open source first. Like, even I think, you know, since the divestiture of Watson, I think like there's now like the official divestiture of it, but like there's still a remaining IP or something around like this Watson X kind of like approach for that they're doing some partnership with Hugging Face, if I recall. And so I do think there's like maybe some pivots toward making open source more important in the go-to-market strategy, even more so than like when we were there, Andrew. So, but on the other hand, you're right. Like sometimes, and this is I think a constant controversy in open source generally, and even in open science, like even in AI research, like I was just at NeurIPS last week, you know, you see tons of publications from people that are corporate sponsored, right? Like Google, Alibaba, like et cetera, Netflix, you name it, right? And some commitments to that open science are more so than others. I would say like probably around the time that we were there, you know, it might have been more like claims around open source, but maybe like the actual monetary sponsorship and support, as well as like contributions like back to open source were more limited than what I'm seeing today. And I think today also there's some organizations that do it a lot better than others. For instance, like, you know, Google has contributed a lot of successful open source projects that we rely on, like Kubernetes, JAX, TensorFlow, right? All of these things. But then when I kind of zoom back and I go back to like IBM's contributions to open source, and like it's harder for me to rattle these things off, right? So I don't know, Andrew, if you have you've seen like a really successful publication, like example of it, but I think for me anyway, it's hard for me to pinpoint like IBM's major open source contributions.
Yeah, I guess basically what I saw is that IBM and perhaps, you know, other companies of the same size, they saw open source as they were more of a user of open source than producing.
Yes.
Whereas Google had a different way to monetize. They had an ad model, so they can afford that. Selling software wasn't their revenue stream, so it was a different play there. But with IBM, selling software is part of it, and services. But so they were more of a user of open source. I'm just curious now as we move forward into what we imagine to be, you know, an ideal knowledge commons. You know, what does it look like? What does the interplay between these large corporations look like with the community? Is there a medium? Yeah. We don't know, but in order for it to succeed, we suspect there needs to be. There has to be the proper incentive structure, and we just don't know what it is. So I'm curious as to what you think on what it could be. Just imagining what that looks like, given that, you know, for-profit does have a bottom line motivation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, like how it's like history repeats itself. I feel like we're always, you know, like even in the past, we've always been like trying to find these justifications and incentives for open source. Like this is like a perpetual thing from the dawn of time. Like, you know, like, oh yeah, tell me like, why should we invest in Docker? Oh yeah, like why? And then you look at all these open source technologies that we've all benefited from. And even like, like LLMs, let's just take this as the modern example. Like we wouldn't have this without open science. And I kind of see open source and open science, as like two, what is the English saying? Two sides of the same coin. Is that the right one?
Yes, yes.
Anyway, yes, ESL for me. But
Have you seen there's a newer model, open language model, OLM. It's like a small grassroots, it started as sort of a grassroots-ish project, but where there's complete transparency into all aspects of the model and you can set up, you can fine tune it exactly to your liking. But there's risks with open source as well. So what do you perceive as the risks?
Well, I think the biggest one that I guess was like a hot topic, because DeepSeek's performance has been so incredible. I think this is an immediate topic of conversation, even before last week, but that I heard very prevalently last week across more of the industry attendees at NeurIPS, which is maybe for people not familiar, it's like one of the largest AI research conferences. So when generally, when we open source something, we should have some understood agreements that, like this is, we have like, and to be fair, I think there's a lot of controversy right now also about the licensing of open source, but maybe that's a totally different thread. But, when we open source things in general, like we're like, hey, if you're going to use this for below X kind of commercial sizing or like usage, then, you can use it for free. But if you're planning to scale that, like, that's goes against the license. We kind of also expect like your open source contributions should not have security flaws or, other, things in there that could be jailbroken or like compromised very easily, like by design. Of course, we can't help it if there are sometimes those things, but, not intentionally releasing this kind of malicious open source software. But like, open source is completely based on trust. Like, like Jessica, Andrew, and I, all three of us could just open source something tomorrow that we vibe coded, right? And like, technically there's, it's a moment of trust that when we upload it, it's not something, malicious. But yeah, I don't know. It's like with DeepSeek too, it's like, hey, people, they're excited at the opportunities because DeepSeek is so performant. It's open source. You can kind of control a lot of variables. But then the question becomes like, how open source is it and what's like really baked in that maybe you don't know about? Because I think there's also things like, well, sometimes we say it's open source, but the model weights aren't really like available, or like the underlying like data engineering processes or something else is like not really truly open source, right? It's like superficially open source. So I think there's this is like a pretty big contention right now because we don't have necessarily like good agreements in that, but but long live open source. We still, we should still let DeepSeek have open source. We should let Mistral, like we should have these models.
And so I do want to jump forward. I know this isn't in our order of operations here, but about the Open Data Science Conference, because I had the opportunity to see you and visit that conference for just a little bit. But can you tie in that conference and the work you've done around that and how that behaves as kind of a commons?
Yeah, for sure. And it's so speaking, that's a good segue about trust, right? Like, so there's certain open source communities that, I think we can reliably trust and have certain expectations on what's being delivered to the community. For example, Linux Foundation has been a long one. And then there's a lot in the AI space, like Hugging Face, et cetera. Open Data Science, huge shout out to Seamus, Alina, like that whole crew. They do the Boston event as well as the San Francisco event. I was like so humbled. They gave us an award. Amy and I got a community award this week along with Cal at Debate. It's like they do a lot of trainings. They also curate, but their main thing is that they curate this really highly trusted community to come give talks. And it's not really about selling you something or like my next widget or something like this, but it's like bringing in the real practitioners to come talk about like what's real and what isn't, like how things are actually working in the open source community. They do also prioritize open source talks as well, and not just specific technologies and tools. So that's been really fun over the last, I think I've been going to ODSC now 5 or 7 years.
Wow.
I feel like,
Yeah.
yeah. And they just celebrated their like 10th or something, 10th or 11th year anniversary.
I mean, it's really interesting because it was such a really wonderful community of practitioners. You really had the sense of practitioners sharing their crafts and their learnings, which I think is very powerful. And opportunities and communities where that's available are really important for, not only the commons, but also for society as a whole, and back to research. So back to that original, the idea of supporting things through research and proliferating and making knowledge available, or information and knowledge available. But like jumping, so that sort of community, and I think that's more of what we're talking about. Something that's come up generally in communities that I've been involved with, and I'm curious if this ever comes up in any of your work, is the idea of knowledge commons being self-governing community. It can be socialized, and that it's founded on having certain agreements. As you said, trust. I think trust is built on agreements and rules. So I don't know if you can speak to that and how you see that playing out in general within these open communities or these knowledge commons.
Yeah, I feel like it's, one of the things and one reason, we started both like this think tank as well as, Generationship also like to, is kind of a knowledge commons maybe, if you, I guess, depending on how far you want to stretch the definition, right? Because we're also curating a certain kind of trust and like broadening the audience in that way. And then open data science, absolutely, I would completely put that squarely in the definition you just provided of a knowledge commons, and like having these agreements, right? Because you're like, essentially for ODSC, we're having agreements that, hey, you're not here to just like sell a random vibe coded widget, like you're actually here to contribute knowledge. And then we're all going to go agree to like curate this information that's more authentic, and then give that back to the community at no cost, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have the cost of the ticket, but like the insights that come out of that community are like at no cost to anyone, right? And then I don't know if this is where you want me to head, but like, and feel free to jump in if I'm totally like going a different direction. But like, with Generationship also, we invest in like, for example, here we're investing in female founders and AI and infrastructure. And like and one reason we love investing in infrastructure is that like infrastructure is itself, like, I feel like a knowledge commons, because like, we're building this to execute agreements between people and large, like, multi-demographic groups of people, like engineers, product people, et cetera. It's like basically the ultimate consensus in a project or a technology group is the infrastructure. Like, hey, I need my data.
That's where people get tripped up, is that the commons should be free. And I don't know that that's necessarily true, because they're cost of keeping the lights on, and for the platforms and for the effort and the research, like ultimately that does have to be funded somehow to support the commons. But to Generationship, like obviously there's rules, and that's exactly where I was going. Tell us more about Generationship. I mean, it's a commons of sorts that's specific to enabling certain, populations that have traditionally been marginalized in tech.
Yeah, and so again, I don't know, but I think before the call, and we were talking, and Andrew was like, "Is this just part of your DNA?" And I was like, "Yeah, kind of," because so the reason for Generationship, or one reason, is less than 2% of venture capital goes to female founders. And what is the agreed definition of a female-founded company? It's 33%, or at least 33% ownership of the company, right? And so that's sort of like the rules that we're kind of adhering to, and we're saying, hey, we're looking for all of like all of you amazing people want to change the statistic. And like we kind of know the rules of the game more broadly in venture, but like, you know, we want to make that accessible to a broader audience. And yes, there should be, I completely agree that Jessica and Andrew, that we should have compensation for knowledge commons. And if someone smarter than me out there has figured out the path, I talked to like a couple of people who had some ideas around this, like for example, being able to compensate people for in the open source world. This has always been a challenge, right? But I would love to hear that as a sidebar. But anyway, back to generationship. Yes. So, and we're like, hey, if you're working in AI and infrastructure, which is again, like for us, the ultimate like evergreen kind of problem that everyone contributes to and can pay for and fix, like that's sort of where we want to put our energy into. And so, yeah, that's sort of I guess the knowledge commons that we're working on at Generationship.
Which I think is so important. And Andrew, he has a daughter who's rising and a software engineer who's very, very talented. So I was singing your praises, Michelle, too, Catalina. So
amazing.
Because it is very prohibitive, you know, for a lot of women in tech. There's other issues aligned with that, but 33%, I didn't actually realize that detail. Yeah.
Yes. And, you know, it's also just, and actually it goes back to the thing that irked me back at IBM, which is this hoarding of knowledge. You know, a lot of it has to do too, not necessarily just, of course, there's like the inherent biases and things like that, but also just lack of knowledge sharing, right? Because, you know, there's a lot of people, because it is so network based, I would say venture is probably like 98% network based, if not more, having been both on the founding side and the investment side now. And like, because of that, it like kind of network science or graph structure, it's like, well, if you don't have, you know, 100 friends that have started companies and have been through all the problems like and challenges of that journey, you're going to be like that single node that's sort of left out and maybe not having access to that knowledge, or it's harder for you to get that knowledge. So that's what we're trying to solve for.
Do you find that people oppose the mission or tend to challenge the very premise of Generationship, or have you found it? Because I know that you travel, just to give context, you travel around to different cities, you know, where you kind of open up the opportunity for people to learn about Generationship.
Yeah, all the time. So especially I think in the current general climate, there's a lot of people who either like, you know, disagree fundamentally with the mission, or, you know, I like, even during my own founding journey, I've been told like, yeah, women can't be technical. Like, you know, this is we don't really believe in this thesis at all. And so, and again, that's fine, like to each their own, but there's plenty who don't believe that way. And I think, you know, part of the challenge of any like knowledge commons really, and I guess it's like, actually, I never thought of Generationship as a knowledge commons until I talked to both of you, but like, maybe this is a pretty common challenge, is that like, you know, how do you really rally like the support and like consistent support for that? Just like any open source project too, right? To like continue that momentum and like make some meaningful impact in the area you're curating information for.
You know, Michelle, I think you helped us define that, because you said earlier, we want to provide accessibility to a broader audience. I kind of think that is a very good definition of the knowledge commons. Opening the aperture to knowledge to a broader audience so that you can provide equity. What else do you see? What is it beyond that? Like, you know, Jessica was talking about my daughter. Of course, she comes to me with challenges she has even in the classroom about answering questions, and people say, "Oh, no, that's not the answer." You know, mostly boys saying that's not correct. So she has to fight her way for every answer. I found that at IBM, in fact, just to dig into that a little bit. I remember an engineer that I worked with, we were working with another team, won't say who, and I was leading, it was like this Kubernetes group at the time. It was new. And so I had some knowledge on it, but she learned quite a bit very quickly. She was precocious, and she was giving answers in a group to this other team, and they were completely ignoring her. And sad to say, I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. So she slacked me and said, "Hey, can you tell them this? This is my next answer, and I want to see what they say." And so I said, "Sure, no problem." I did. Guess what they said? They said, "That's a good idea, Andrew." And that was really, I mean, that was like well into my career until I realized that this was a real issue. And sure enough, she did it again and again. And here's the person who had a lot of great input and answers. They weren't listening to her. So for that specific scenario, and then this is happening, within the industry all the time. I mean, without leaning on the opposite sex to help you do that, to help you push through that, like in that very specific example, how do you get past that?
Yeah.
Like, what do you say to my daughter?
Well, first of all, thank you for being an ally to her and trying to, even if you didn't like fully recognize the whole situation, like you were trying to help like communicate her ideas, at least in that form. I would say like, and this is exactly why we need more publicly shared knowledge commons, like and like the work at least for me personally, like Generationship and like everything I've done in research also matters so much, because I think it's really important for people to see like examples of people like themselves, whatever your demographic is, like, or whatever your situation is. But you want to see people like basically having a merit-based mechanism to like showcase their ideas. And I think, for example, I think Jessica, you do a great job of, and I'm sure like you probably face challenges as well, but like I read the Ontology Pipeline, I read the Substack, and I'm sorry.
I'm glad to hear.
Oh, thank you. Okay. But I think this is where knowledge commons are so valuable, because like maybe you don't in your workplace or like somewhere else, maybe you don't have like the voice to like say or promote your ideas, which are very good and valid. But there are safe spaces out there. And like, that's where I do think where again, there's always going to be like some naysayer somewhere, but a lot of times you can see examples of like, hey, like Jessica's putting her work out there on Substack and publishing, and the ideas speak for themselves, right? And so regardless of like the naysayers, if you put something really incredible out on open source, or like you publish something in research, which I also consider a big knowledge commons, right? I would say like, like there's communities, I would tell your daughter like, hey, there's some incredible communities out there that will hear you out in a merit-based way. It's just a matter of like finding and networking with them. Like I'm also on the board of Women in Data, and like that's another great organization or to get this kind of support. And then B, like I would say there's also like, don't be afraid to put ideas out there in these kind of safer like open source or knowledge common spaces, depending on what you're doing. Like in research, it could be a publication, etc. Because like there are spaces where people will hear your idea out in a legitimate way. So, and if we didn't have commons, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's essentially like finding the town square that's going to give you a podium in which people don't have these kind of inclinations that they would in an organization and the cultures that lie therein.
Yeah, exactly. And not just to get you on the podium, but also like help you think through the idea, like with valid, constructive like feedback, not like your idea stinks, goodbye. Like, right. But like a real forum for having a conversation on your idea.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to continue to propagate some of those ideas. And it is hard. I mean, we see it on social media all the time. I experience it with my Substack, even where you do feel like you have to work much harder, and it's a little bit more of a claw to get ideas heard and seen. And so grateful to have platforms and opportunities, but also, to build community around that, where people do feel safe and can feel supported so that they can grow. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one thought that just came to mind as you were saying that, Jessica, is like the other thing is people sometimes think because it's a knowledge commons or something that you're trying to expand and help broader demographics, that it also doesn't serve your interest. Let's say like to get ROI or whatever it is, right? Like the business goal. And I think that's also something with like open source and as well as like generation shift, we can easily debunk, right? Because and we can easily debunk that like that for example your coworker at the time, let's say she started a company now and like promoted her ideas out to a product and we invested in it. It's pretty straightforward for us to prove that our thesis is actually also about it's not a compromise is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. That it's based on merit, and obviously, yeah. And that's something that it's not a charity. It's something that is just, and that's I feel like we do tend to misinterpret the idea of a commons. And I got into some pretty interesting discussions this weekend with some folks about this, in that it's not necessarily a charity. It doesn't have to be, it could be. But really broadening our scope and our understanding, where it's really about, like you said before, Andrew, it's supporting the ideas and supporting people to have like a community in which, you can grow those ideas. I think that's the most important thing. So do you mind going into some of your healthcare research and how it relates in the CAMI think tank? Because I had an opportunity to present at CAMI think tank this summer in San Francisco, and it is such a phenomenal project. It's such a cool project, and it truly is creating a commons. I actually told just too much information here, but my hand surgeon about it, and I think he signed up, by the way. But
that's amazing.
Yeah, and he really appreciates it. So because it is hard, even for super smart doctors and researchers, to determine what's real, what's not. So I'll hand it over to you for that.
Yeah, and I think, and again, this is, I feel like I guess I'm doing a lot of my kind of impactful efforts, maybe out of spite, sort of like this fight against like knowledge hoarding, because, and so, yeah, like I mentioned, I got super interested in the intersection of AI and healthcare and life sciences because of my own personal history, like because my mom had passed from breast cancer, and like we were too poor at the time to afford treatment. But like I always saw opportunity, like if we use technology and like, there's a ton of opportunity to use AI, not in like a superficial way, but to actually help doctors, not like all the blabber about replacing them, blah, 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 like ignore that stuff. But like there's a real opportunity to actually use the technology to make certain treatments more accessible. And so this is like my whole common theme of I guess the Michelle knowledge common. But and so like that's really where this think tank was born out of, because I just see so many, like there was a Anthropic, like Claude for life science, OpenAI is now doing life science, and there's probably like hundreds of startups now claiming that they solve healthcare or life sciences in some form or fashion, right? And I think there's just so much noise, and so our goal with this was to like bring the voices of real practitioners, people who like are working at organizations like American Cancer, or like if they could be research like private businesses, but like chief science officers, like people really from the front lines, and then having them talk about how they're actually using the technology successfully. So yeah, that's sort of like the side quest I have with CAMI Think Tank, and trying to bring like curated, authentic knowledge about AI and its applications in healthcare versus like just everything you're trying to be sold nowadays.
Yeah, and it seems like even peer-reviewed scholarly research, it's hard to tell what's actually peer-reviewed and what's actually scholarly, because it all looks like academic scholarly papers. We're having kind of a moment for that.
Yeah, it's true. Even at NeurIPS, I just feel so bad for the volunteer. It's all volunteer run, and it's just like the sheer number of submissions this year that were also Gen AI aided was like unprecedented.
Yeah, and the AI aided, and actually that goes into like a whole. We should do another episode on that one, on writing composition and writing in general. But yes, the idea of formulating ideas and embodying research and legitimate research. That's like one of my favorite areas of librarianship, which is scholarly communications, which sadly has been defunded in today's climate. But scholarly communications is a fascinating form of librarianship where its sole goal and role is to open up channels for communicating scholarly research so that we don't repeat each other's research, but we can build upon each other's research. And that's something that also resonated with me with CAMI Think Tank was that aspect of sort of, also the dialogue that happens, that occurs, and hopefully builds and evolves in the communities that you form from that sort of commons.
Yeah, and actually, I think this, I don't know, maybe now I'm becoming a promoter, a real advocate of knowledge commons, because now I'm thinking of like, I do genuinely believe that these like more authentic, like real practitioner and like curated sources of information are going to be even more valuable over time. One of the best papers that was awarded actually was this paper around the hive mind. And essentially there's the TLDR here is that there's a mathematical way to show now, like I'm sure, in the beginning when Gemini and OpenAI, like you all probably saw like, oh yeah, they're pretty different. Like they're really, they have different features, they have different capabilities. And now fast forward, like they're actually quite similar in a lot of respects, right? I'm sure as you guys have been using and looking at all the latest releases, it's like, oh, now they all have video gen. Now they all kind of talk like this, or they all do something. And now there's a mathematical way to actually show this. So I'll send you and Andrew the paper. I think you guys would really enjoy this.
Our show notes are going to be like a huge long
yeah. I can't wait. Yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on this. And like, actually now I'm excited to think about like the role of knowledge commons in this context.
Well, like, yeah, go ahead.
There's two types of commons I'm seeing emerging that I guess I didn't differentiate. One is this practitioner commons. This is commons about a craft, really, and then sharing that sort of thing. And then there's also the data commons that may be, sensors or people recording information and sharing that as really an outcome of their craft. Which do you think is more important if you had to take one or the other?
I can't pick. Oh no. Oh, that's so hard to pick.
Let's just assume the data is well described.
Mm-hmm.
The user can infer a lot, or commons of practitioners, or maybe their efforts and their works are behind closed doors, but their craft is being shared openly across their peers.
I think because of my bent toward AI research, I would lean toward practitioner, only because, and like I know you could probably argue both ways. Maybe if Andrew, you tell me if I'm interpreting your question in this way correctly, but like one way to argue it is like, well, we have open data, open benchmarks, right? Like open evals, open models, and then that's sort of like the more on the data common side, right? Like we have mechanisms that everyone can use these resources. On the other hand, there's like who's curating like the gate mechanisms that are going to give us longer context window, that like publishing this core IP. And like if I put it into my AI research world, as well as like who is developing like the models and curating that knowledge and sharing like these sort of more fundamental like research oriented IP publications. Yeah. Oh, now that I'm talking out aloud, it's also now I'm like going back to data commons. Oh no, because I'm like, well, there's more like in the general public and average like user that could take advantage of the data commons, but there's so much more like fundamental innovation that we have access to through the practitioner commons. So the researcher in me is like practitioner commons, and then like the open source person in me is like data commons.
Which I think both can exist.
I'm cheating.
I made it hard specifically, but I think there's a happy medium between the two. One quick follow-up question. So the Data Commons has produced these technologies that allow people to get quick answers through things like generative AI. And I guess the way I see it is almost causing like this societal entropy where people are not doing what you did when you went to college at age 16. They're not
Not
looking,
age 13.
they're not going through the yeah, so like how do you get to a point where people are still excited about the learning process and this technology is here that is such an easy and tempting grab just to go ahead and use that? How do you make more Michelle Yees in the world when you're creating this technology? Is that even possible? Do you see that we're kind of going in a downward spiral in some ways? Or do you see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel? How does that work? How do people stay motivated when they have everything? I mean, this reminds me of science fiction episodes. I can name a few where like humanity relies on like this AI machine and they stop thinking about things.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess in general, I tend because again, like I come from that more research background, like I tend to be more optimistic. But then, I see the reality of things. I'm like, oh, bad. Like I see all the lawsuits and like these terrible things with the like character.ai and some of those things. And I'm just like, oh, this is really horrible the way that it's going in for the majority of like the public. Right. And then like all the implications for like artists and things like that as well. Because we're so poor, at least in the US, I can't speak for other countries, but in the US, we're so poor about trust and agreements around and policy and things like that. But I will say, like, although there are a lot of negative examples, and I'm kind of scared to think of a world where there are more Michelle Yees, that's pretty terrifying. But I think in that, maybe a more positive example is like this one story that I heard based on NeurIPS was like, oh yeah, there's actually people who have used generative AI, for example, to help them learn English as well. I have heard stories about this, right? Where like, they maybe didn't have access or couldn't afford like tutors and things like that, but they were using generative AI in ways that would actually help them think through like how to solve mathematical equations or like be able to practice a language, etc. So those opportunities are there, but then of course, I've also heard the other side, which is people just ask for the answer, right? No, it's not about like using the AI as a coach or like resource, like you would have the library back in my day. And so I guess at the end of the day, it just comes down to like encouraging like more critical thinking and like more on the human psychology and human behavior than like, and really cultivating like a desire to learn and stay curious. And how you do that, I don't know if there's a good answer to that, but I think that's just even more important now than ever, because if you don't have that, like if that's not your starting point, then yeah, you're just going to take advantage of tools to give you the right answer at the right time and just not really think critically about like why you should at least try to understand the fundamental concepts before just asking for the answer.
And ultimately, to add to that, and I don't know what you think of this statement, but ultimately humans are the owners of knowledge. Humans own knowledge. Humans are the creators and owners of knowledge. Personally, and this may be more my personal take, but the idea that knowledge is created or generated by a machine, humans own the machines. That even if it did generate something fantastic, and the idea of embodying knowledge, but also owning, and being stewards of knowledge, I think that speaks also more to that aspect, that you can't manage knowledge if you don't have some sense of ownership or stewardship. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm curious how, in general, I'm inclined to agree. Because at the end of the day, like a lot of the models, they're pre-trained on human knowledge anyway, good and bad. Like let's put it out there. Sometimes I'm not sure what's on Reddit is real knowledge, but I think some people might argue like, oh, well, there's more emergent behaviors or like, and again, this is not really, I think the research is not entirely there to like say like, yes, 100%, like this was like truly novel knowledge or context. But like, I think there are people out there who would argue like, well, yes, we're going to have increasingly like, increasing examples of emergent behaviors of models whereby like some discoveries are truly novel. But I would argue probably in the current state of things, I would agree with you that no.
Well, and ultimately, even if the emergent behaviors and knowledge does occur, humans still must be the stewards of that knowledge or decide what to do with that knowledge.
That's true. So, like, for example, there's one interesting scenario. Maybe this is going way off the deep end, so you can tell me. But like, I was having a debate recently, like, oh, well, let's say that AGI existed and I gave you the solution to climate change. What happens next? But anyway, that was a whole debate. So
I like the deep end, so please.
Yeah. This is like our day-to-day between myself and Andrew.
Oh my gosh, that's so
let's go to the deep end.
Oh no. But yeah.
There was a solution that I don't know if it was just in the news this week with blocking the sun. It was assisted by AI, that there's technologies that are now being created around this idea of just blocking the sun to help with global warming. So
I don't know if I would trust like current state recommendations, but like let's say this future scenario, I mean, that is like it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, okay, if we had true quote unquote AGI, like it's all solved for, and it just gave us this like perfect solution, here's how you're going to solve it and not destroy yourselves.
How do you know, Michelle, when to trust? Like as in the field, like at what point do you say, I'm going to trust what's being said by this near AGI that we think it is? How do you know?
I don't think we have. I don't think we do know, to be honest. It's so interesting because there was, I listened to like 3 different talks last week about what are the criteria of, and it's / like milestones of, AGI, and it's also depending on which background you're coming from, right? Because some people, let's say they come from like a reinforcement learning background, right? And so, Sutton will say like, well, AGI is something that can like abstract, like, and continually learn and reason over these abstractions as it learns, like, and you're never going to have AGI without RL, right? And then like others, Melanie Mitchell from the Santa Fe Institute, right? She does a lot of research on like, well, are we actually like, how do we think about non-human intelligences and how do we evaluate them? Because like we're saying that it can reason like a human, or maybe it doesn't reason like a human, but like how are we going to distinguish this, and when and in what scenarios does each one matter? And I think we still really don't understand this. Like we don't have a good definition on agreed definition, as you both like to point out. And it's true. I think this is still very nascent. Like each person based on their background is going to have a different definition. And then if you ask Sam Altman, like it's just going to be here in like 3 years, right? So I think it's still TBD. Like we don't have a good answer.
I think that overarching, it's just about definitions and agreements, right?
I agree. I mean, if this space doesn't have shared definitions, they don't have shared understandings. So then it leaves itself to the loudest voice in the room to say what it means. Does it not?
Yeah, I think, well, and I guess maybe this is also part of like when you're working in research in a new space, like in the beginning, well, I guess we're not really in the beginning. Like AI research has existed for like since like early 1900s, but like, or 1950, mid 1900s. But like, when it's still in the process of being defined, because it is still in the research space, I would agree. Like we're still working toward like what exactly are the capabilities? How do you get there? what do we agree as like the definition of what AGI can and can't do. I think that's still like, and that's part, it's just I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it's still a problem associated with the nature of like where we are in the research field.
It seems like the researchers would be amenable to having a shared definition and coming together, but it's the business and marketing side who like things kind of malleable, fluid, and a definition that agrees with the topic at hand. So that seems to be a point of contention.
Yeah, absolutely. There's pressure, as this, you have like, I mean, and even in the ivory tower world, we have like, it's not so easy to get researchers to, as you know, Andrew, probably from your IBM days, it's not so straightforward to get researchers to agree on definitions also, like in some cases, especially when it's still like very much in the works. But I think it's a great idea. We should have some consensus around that. Because I think what you're pointing out is this is exactly what's happening now, right? That leaves room for like these marketing and other kind of players to jump in and define it for us.
And we even see it in the terminology we use in general when we do talk about AI and advancements, is just the idea of like context is such a broad term. It can go in so many directions for so many people. The idea of a prompt, like the marketing terms that we've created, we all do need shared vocabularies and definitions. Of course, I'm a big believer of that, but it also that dance with marketing, so many companies, especially, we see this in Silicon Valley since we're both kind of in that area. It's such a, it's perpetuated. It's the nature, it's the very economy of the area, the region. And the stakes are very, very high.
Yeah, and this is making me also reflect a bit more is we, like on the research side, we also don't necessarily agree on the definition. I went to a really interesting session on memorization. And, and there's even some like, hey, the way that we've been talking very broadly about memorization within the context of large language models is like, it's too broad because now the general public thinks it's just about regurgitation.
Yes.
But the thing is like, well, let's say we solved this problem of regurgitation. Like, okay, the model no longer one-to-one spits out Harry Potter in this example. But would we be happy with that? Would we have solved the problem of memorization?
A great example.
Probably not.
No.
And so then that session was actually a really nice technical deep dive into like, okay, then if it's not one-to-one, then are we now talking about, is memorization about distributions of data, right? So like, because it's not necessarily about exact replication, because if they spit out something that's 70% like the ontology pipeline, you'd probably still be upset, right? But not 100%, hey, it's not memorization, we didn't regurgitate 100% of it, right? And so like, even in like something that we thought we understood so well, or like, oh, that we just commonly throw out the term, oh yeah, it's just memorized. Well, actually, it's not that simple. So.
And that's a really salient point and important that we're conscious, because it's very easy to kind of get sucked into the idea with the terminology, and especially with being able to speak this common language and be cognizant of the risks. We have to understand the risks, and that again goes back to definitions.
Yeah, why don't we have an ontology for AI research? Andrew, Jessica, is this your next project?
I think so.
Come to NeurIPS next year. It's in Sydney.
Yeah, I'm down. I'm there. I know that the EU does have an AI ontology, but I looked at it at the EU, the emerging one, or the one that was recently published. Don't misquote. I might be not speaking truth here totally, but there is one that I downloaded, and it wasn't very comprehensive.
Well, the thing is, like, this ontology, this definitions or whatever you want to call ontology, etc., would need to be like I mean, I think a person would have to go to probably every major research conference and every industry conference. And so your group of people contributing to this knowledge commons would need to be extremely large, I think.
Oh, I would love that project. I would love to do that. Maybe that's is to come up with like a comprehensive process knowledge oriented ontology for AI.
Michelle, do you think that terminology is going to come out of this space that is not exactly like terms that we attribute to humans, such as memory? Like memory is something that is our grounding, the baseline as to what we think memory is as we exercise it. Do you think there will be terminology like they just throw in the towel? We can't exactly say this is human memory, but it is something and it's something else. So it's related, but not the same. Has that happened? Does new terminology come about that says this is something different and it deserves its own term, and we give up about trying to relate it back to human terms? Is that a?
There are certain terms that would be very specific to just like on the technical side. So like random one, like backpropagation. We would never like talk about humans doing backpropagation, but maybe in terms of like capability or something that's more borderline intersecting with what humans do, but that is so alien, like Melanie Mitchell's talk, like, oh, we're really dealing with a like non-human intelligence and need new vocabulary for that. That besides the technical words, like I'm trying to think, I can't think of one off the top of my head that we've actually created. There's maybe world models might be like we were talking about earlier, like what is a world model? Like this is kind of a different task because humans kind of learn the world model it inherently, but this is something you have to build for machines. Yeah, I can't think of one that's like completely fresh. Like, of course, we've created all these new terms, but I think it's mostly technical. Yeah, I was trying to think. Maybe reasoning would be another. But like human, because we're so like convinced that we need to have like system 2 reasoning like humans have, but maybe we don't. I don't know. Maybe is that kind of like a question you're heading toward, Andrew?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Maybe it just doesn't fit, but it's something, but not. It's not and cannot be what we do.
No.
And is it wrong if it isn't? I think that's like a big question. Yeah, like so Melanie Mitchell's research is really fascinating around. She has several books on this topic, but like she studies reasoning, and it's like, well, is it wrong if it doesn't reason the way the human does?
Interesting. Yeah.
Maybe not.
I was actually diving into this on my walk today because I've been down a rabbit hole on just inference, how we're throwing around the word inference now and what that really means, because it's been productized as well. But then you have logical reasoning models where you have inference, and then you have structures where you have symbolic structures where you have inference. Like it's such a wide open term. But that's also how we give credit to ourselves or give ourselves badges or validate our methodologies is by saying, oh, this supports inference. And if that sort of definition is so wide open and could mean so many different things, it just begs the question like of dialing that back or having sort of tighter qualifiers for research and the publishing of research around these things. I personally find it to be important just because it's anyone can stake any claim, but what that really means and how it impacts AI research, I think is really important.
Yeah, I do think there's more work that research that needs to be done around like, and Mitchell's lab like focuses on this, like how we study and understand this sort of like non-human intelligence. But I think there's a lot more opportunity to think about this because I think, Andrew, another point that you're making me think of is like, a lot of our confusion around this also is probably stemming from the fact that we're trying to like pigeonhole like, oh, well, a reasoning model is like one that reasons, like, you know, like all this psychology around system 2 thinking, right? But like, but is that really like the most important thing we should be working toward or enabling? Yeah.
Yeah. This is where I saw, like, even at IBM or just in a startup previously, that the practical side of the organization is quick to dispense of trying to map it to something that's like human. They're like, well, does it have utility? Does it work? I don't care. You know, that's what matters, because I mean, it's simplistic what that side of the organization thinking of, like, how do we increase the bottom line? Who cares what it is? But it also moves the ball forward, because then you're not getting into these endless debates or trying to approximate the humanness of your creation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I guess, because in so much of our history, like, and actually in her talk, she also pointed this out, like the way that we benchmark things has a baked in assumption that like human capabilities are the most advanced, right? Like of any species. And so like, so our benchmarks for, like, for example, the ArcGIS, like there's this whole like thing called ArcGIS and like Arc in terms of reasoning for benchmarking. And this was based on an old psychology exam. So it was founded by this ex-Google researcher, Francois Chollet, who specialized in this. And now it's like a really well-known prize that people try to beat the benchmark to basically prove their model's reasoning capabilities. But the exam is based off of, like, I think it's something like 1,000 or something type of tasks this was designed, like, I forget what, a long time ago in psychology as like basic fundamental human tasks. So it includes things like, hey, humans know how to like Tetris pattern match different shapes and objects, and like it increases in complexity. Like, can you take all the triangles out, take all the squares out, etc. Right. And like they're different colors, and then it's like a range of kind of like logic puzzles like this. And actually what was interesting is, like, so there's several problems with some, like, benchmarks, and one problem with this particular benchmark is like, some people again, because sometimes there's not trust. And so some people are like, maybe there's data contamination, like maybe it's similar, they've intentionally introduced some of like similar test data or like similar examples into the training process, right? And so the models are performing really well. But then like the more interesting class of responses is like the models that, like, let's assume that we can trust that they didn't like do any data contamination, is, oh, hey, they're actually able to perform really well, let's say 70% on the ARC benchmark, but they didn't get there doing it the exact way the human would. Like what basically some of the models ended up doing was interpreting the colors in a set of like 0 to 5, and then like, right, and then like solving for like what is or isn't in the bounding box of like within that shape. And so it's like, yeah, we wouldn't solve it that way, but it got the job done. So.
Well, and I think the bigger issue ethically as well is, we do know, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but it's been pretty clear and evident, like in terms of, the senses and human intelligence being tied to the senses, smelling, obviously we have vision, but smelling, hearing, seeing, tasting. And there's been a lot of research in that area. And its contributions, and how can you fully have intelligence if you don't have all of the senses? So there's that other part. You can have system 1, system 2, but if you don't have that input, how do you emulate that input if your goal was to emulate human intelligence?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're definitely carving out like specific problems that we're able to solve for right now.
Yes.
Probably voices, like audio in general, is going to become probably the next solvable area. But then, I don't know about the progress on like some of the others.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty expansive as a field, and it's super interesting though. Yeah. Michelle, thank you for being on. This was such a treat to have you here. And we'd love to have you back at some point as we kind of go on our journeys. and come back and reconvene so we can talk more about this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew and Jessica, for having me. It's been super fun, and I definitely am thinking. I feel I've been inspired to think differently about like the challenge of the knowledge commons and like what the definition of it is actually, and like how to apply that across. Anyway, I'm sort of like starting to nerd out on some other ideas like now what if we look at sets of knowledge commons and then look like and then study attributes of sets of knowledge commons and like
I personally think that's like the goodness of what comes with like, provides opportunities, and you're providing opportunities for people. You're helping with research and coalescing research and improving that whole, that essence of academia and life sciences. It's so important. So it's very exciting.
You've earned your Commons badge today.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Wait, do you guys have this is another idea. Like, do you
And
have
forthcoming Knowledge Commons t-shirt. You
one?
have to wear it.
Oh my gosh, I would definitely wear a badge if you had one. I would wear
Badges. We can definitely spin up some badges.
I will be an angel investor in this. Let me know when you need. I'll fund it.
Okay, I'm recording. We have it recorded, so we're going to take you up on that.
Awesome. It's a deal. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
much.
you. All right.
We'll see you.
Bye.